The left has spent the last week suggesting that democracy in America is in danger, and it's in danger because of those evil Republicans and their willingness to throw out votes and overthrow election processes. Ezra Klein has an entire article in the New York Times talking about the evils of Republicans. His piece is titled "Steve Bannon is Onto Something." Why? Because Steve Bannon has talked about the fact that Republicans need to do politics locally. So Ezra Klein says, there are people for the Democrats working on a plan B. This week, I half-jokingly asked Ben Wickler, the chairman of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, what it felt to be like on the front lines of protecting American democracy. He replied, dead serious, by telling me what it was like. He spends his days obsessing over mayoral races in 20,000-person towns because those mayors appoint the city clerks who decide whether to pull the drop boxes for mail-in ballots, and small changes to electoral administration could be the difference between winning Senator Ron Johnson's seat in 2022 and having a chance at democracy reform and losing the race and the Senate. Wickler is organizing volunteers to staff phone banks to recruit people who believe in democracy to serve as municipal poll workers, because Steve Bannon has made it his mission to recruit people who don't believe in democracy to serve as municipal poll workers. And then Ezra Klein says that the right is suddenly very good at local politics, which is kind of shocking considering that the right has been terrible at local politics for at least 2 generations and probably longer. In any case, notice how Ezra Klein characterizes this. If you are a Democratic mayoral candidate and you want to put drop boxes, which are inherently less verifiable than, for example, polling booths, if you want to do that, this makes you pro-democracy. If you don't want the drop boxes because you fear that those are COVID temporary installations that should go away, so you should actually have to go in and register to vote, and you should actually have to show your ID, for example, this means that you are bad. And the left wants to broaden out the number of people who can vote, and they want to get rid of a lot of the voter verification methods that Republicans have been pursuing. Ezra Klein says that Republicans are trying to suppress the vote. Quote, voter suppression is happening at every level of government here in Georgia, says Representative Nikema Williams, who chairs the Georgia Democratic Party. We have 159 counties. And so 159 different ways boards of elections are elected and elections are carried out. So we have 159 different leaders who control election administration in the state. We've seen those boards restrict access by changing the number of ballot boxes. Often our black members on these boards are being pushed out. Well, I mean, you'd have to show that they're being pushed out because they're black and not just because they disagree with you, that all the COVID pandemic procedures, which were supposed to be temporary, are now being gotten rid of, and that that's somehow some sort of horrible thing for democracy. Again, none of these things that the Democrats are now talking about is deeply necessary for the business of democracy were present in 2008 when Barack Obama swamped the ballot boxes and won a blowout election, and then won re-election in 2012. None of this stuff existed. But according to Ezra Klein, we have to rig the elections so they don't rig the elections is basically the idea. This is how much we care about democracy, is that we need to put in place all of these procedures that are less verifiable. So he quotes a couple of particular cases. He says, Gabriela Cazares Kelly was a member of the Tejano Odom Nation, agreed to staff a voting registration booth at a community college where she worked in Pima County, Arizona. She was stunned to hear the stories of her students. We keep blaming students for not participating, but it's really complicated to get registered to vote if you don't have a license. The nearest DMV is an hour and a half away, and you don't own a car. She said, well, somehow 155 million Americans came up with the ability to vote in the last election cycle. So instead, she decided that she was going to work on specifically following up with specific people. So for example, the example she gives is that certain people who work for the county recorder's office could work with the postmaster's office to put registration forms in tribal postal offices or not. When it called to voter verify a ballot and heard an answering machine in Spanish, it could follow up in Spanish or not. Well, I mean, that works in reverse as well. If you're specifically only calling up people who have an answering machine in Spanish, and then you only follow up with those people, it could work that way too. Like again, at a certain point, you're going to have to assume that the average comes out in the wash. That you have some Board of Election Advisors who are Democrats, some who are Republicans, and it mainly comes out in the wash. But this is why it's so amazing to hear the left complain that the right is undermining elections while they consistently undermine the veracity of elections. If we don't get our way, the election is corrupt. By the way, again, this would have happened in 2020. If Donald Trump had won, the left would have been the one rioting. This was the great fear leading up to the 2020 election. The great fear leading up to 2020 is if Donald Trump had been declared winner on November 4th, just go back in time and you'll remember this, and there would be widespread riots across the United States. January 6th was the best thing ever to happen to the left because it was a right-wing riot. Okay, but the real worry leading up to November 4th, leading up to the election, was that if Democrats didn't get their way, they would declare the election illegitimate and blame the Postmaster General and blame Trump for rigging the ballot boxes and blame people like Brad Raffensperger in Georgia for rigging the thing. After all, Democrats have been claiming this since 2000. Now, the giveaway is pretty obvious here. The giveaway is that in New York City, Democrats have now made it possible for 1 million non-citizens to vote. So if you are worried about Democrats broadening the vote to people who really should not be voting, they're kind of doing it in broad daylight in New York City. According to Breitbart, up to 1 million non-citizens living in New York City will have access to the ballot box after Mayor Eric Adams on Sunday approved legislation by the city council to automatically become law. So in other words, a bunch of people who are not actually bound by American law because they're illegal immigrants, a bunch of people who are not paying, for example, federal income tax unless they've stolen a social security number, those folks now get to vote in local elections in New York City. Adams said in a statement, "I believe New Yorkers should have a say in their government, which is why I have and will continue to support this important legislation." So I have a question. What's the limiting principle? Why wouldn't Democrats nationally think this applies? Why wouldn't they be attempting to get maybe 15, 20 million illegal immigrants in the country currently to just have the vote? And why is that not some sort of corruption of the electoral process? You have millions and millions of Americans who are voting based on the fact that they pay income tax and are subject to all of the nation's laws. And then you have tens of millions of people who theoretically the Democrats would want to vote while they don't pay full federal income tax, for example. Eric Adams said, "While I initially had some concerns, I had a productive dialogue with my colleagues in government to put those concerns at ease. I believe allowing the legislation to be enacted is by far the best choice and look forward to bringing millions more into the democratic process." According to the left, the way that the democratic process works is that the democratic process is all about every single human, whether they ought to vote or not, being allowed to vote. More than a dozen communities across the United States already allow non-citizens to cast ballots in local elections, including 11 towns in Maryland and 2 in Vermont. The measure enables non-citizens who have been lawful permanent residents of the city for at least 30 days, as well as those authorized to work in the U.S., including so-called dreamers, to help select the city's mayor, city council members, borough presidents, comptroller, and public advocate. You think all those folks are going to be in favor of strict immigration law? Now, the suggestion that Democrats are in favor of allowing a lot of people to enter the country illegally so they can shift the voting, it's hard to see how these folks are very much in favor of American citizens having priority in the vote when they are literally prioritizing non-American citizens voting in local elections. And the idea that shoring up elections is a high priority to Democrats is obviously untrue. The right has been suggesting now for months something called a revision of the Electoral Count Act. So you remember, the Electoral Count Act of 1887 is kind of vague in its specifics. It allowed for a bunch of confusion inside the right wing, particularly in 2020, over whether the vice president of the United States could simply reject votes. Now, the answer was no, but the ECA is kind of unclear. According to Dan McLaughlin, writing for the National Review, the ECA's current language represents the chief point of vulnerability that turned Donald Trump's campaign against the 2020 election into a riot at the Capitol last January 6th. The two most alarming aspects of the aftermath of 2020 were closely related. One was Trump's effort to pressure state governors, state legislatures, Mike Pence, and members of Congress to reject Biden electors chosen by statewide popular vote and substitute Trump electors chosen by state legislatures. A revised ECA could address this particular danger and avoid a repeat of last January 6th in future elections. It would do so by clarifying that the VP cannot unilaterally reject electors, by precluding states that select electors by popular vote from refusing after the fact to recognize electors chosen by that vote, and by raising the vote thresholds to make objections to electors and reject slates of electors certified by a state governor. Right, so this could be cleared up. So you would imagine that Democrats would want to support that, right? I mean, it would prevent things like the argument that the election was illegitimate and that you could have alternative slates of electors created by state legislators. Like, they should be in favor of this, right? Nope. Kamala Harris came out against it over the weekend. Here is VP Harris.
Because it's not a solution to the problem at hand, which is that right now in the United States of America, we need federal laws that guarantee the freedom and right of every American to have access to the ballot, to be able to vote. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, address that issue. And those are the issues that are present and that are imminent and that are really dispositive, frankly, of this moment in time in terms of whether we are going to fight for some of the most important pillars of a democracy, such as the freedom to...
She's ridiculous. Okay, these people are ridiculous. They clearly are not interested in the pillars of democracy. They don't even want to reform the Electoral Count Act to prevent the kind of arguments that Trump was making post-November 4th. They don't care about democracy. They want illegal immigrants to vote, and they don't care about reforming the ECA. All they want is to reform the voting procedures to allow for more people to vote illegally, to allow for the possibility of voter fraud, and to essentially corrupt the voting procedures across the nation through things like ballot harvesting. That's what they actually want. And if they don't get their way, they say that democracy is being undermined. It just demonstrates how full of absolute crap they are. How's this for a title? Ben Shapiro Show subscriber destroys like button with clicks and logic. I'd watch that. Make it happen, gang.